I think you've now heard why Austria, and particularly Chancellor Feynman, are regarded as very constructive and positive voices on this very challenging issue of refugees at the present time. To introduce a keynote speaker that we have with us tonight, I go back actually 35 years. I won't take long to do it, but I was called by the Prime Minister of Canada and asked to come and see him, and he told me that there was a concern that there might be some hidden losses in some of the Crown corporations, the government-owned companies in Canada. And he wanted me to investigate, assess the situation, and give my advice. And I read, and I brooded, and I researched, and found, I can't remember whether it was the notes of a speech or an article by Professor Prodi on industrial challenges of that sort, on the Institute of, what is it called? IRI, Institute of Reconstruction, I think, Industrial Reconstruction, and called Italy, confirmed what I thought had been the experiences after reading what I had from Professor Prodi, and took my advice to the Prime Minister, recommended that we create a merchant bank that would deal with the turnaround and the privatization and the constructive policy advice it might give for industrial progress. I took that to the Prime Minister and essentially left the office as the CEO of Canada Development Investment Corporation because of Professor Prodi. When Henry Kissinger called, he said that despite his enthusiasm for this project, he had a problem, and I came from the school of thought that problems are to be solved. And I said, what's the problem? What can I do to help? And he said, Joel, the problem I have is I'm 92 years of age, and you can't fix that. And the doctors are saying no to Vienna. With the help of a new and wonderful friend, Federico Rampini, whom you will know as a writer on foreign affairs issues for La Repubblica, now based as the bureau chief in the United States, in New York and Washington, we tracked President Prodi down in China. He changed his schedule and landed here about an hour and a half ago to give us this keynote address. So I would introduce Dr., Professor, Prime Minister, and President Prodi with one word: rescuer. The titles, however, describe a professional life of scholarship, public policy, politics, a vision for Europe, in particular its composition, its cohesion, its economy, its currency, and its role. And more recently, adding a more worldview by lecturing on a regular basis in China. I frankly could think of no more appropriate person to address the questions of changes called for in the world order, in emerging conditions, the practical challenges of cooperating across diversity, and the role of various parties at the table than President Prodi.
Mr. President, Chancellor, ladies, gentlemen, authorities, and dear friends, for me it's a great pleasure, but it's also a real privilege to open the Congress of Vienna 2015. I am not a diplomatic historian, and accordingly I will not delve into the historical details of the Congress of Vienna. But in order to clarify the social and political context in which the Congress took place, it seems useful to remind only one figure, about the tragedy of Napoleonic Wars. Although casualties of war are always difficult to measure, France, which was the only country with reliable statistics, lost 1.3 million people during the wars, and a similar number of people were wounded. Since at that time, France had approximately 30 million people population. The losses were mainly concentrated on the males. We can easily conclude that the war was an incredible tragedy for France. But other European countries, such as Germany and Russia, experienced even heavier losses, even if we have not precise statistics. These were the social, political, and human condition in which Europe was at the beginning of the Congress of Vienna. From the history classes of the primary school, we learned that the Congress of Vienna was the starting point of the European restoration after the radical transformation brought about by the French Revolution and the wars. Such a reading of history is, of course, correct. However, gatherings like the one we are participating today are useful if we examine these distant days not only as a conservative attempt to reestablish an old political system and a new international equilibrium, but at the roots of events that were going to reshape Europe. Indeed, the old continent was on the verge of a really new era. The question was not simply creating a new balance of power. The statements of the Congress had to tackle new realities, which had primarily a political and cultural nature rather than a merely military or diplomatic dimension. The organizer kindly asked me to speak about the future prospects of the world order and related issues like the possibility of cooperation among major powers. I like to begin this impossible task with a brief reference to Henry Kissinger's first book. I am referring to his seminal analysis of the Congress of Vienna, the rightly famous A World Restored. In his classic study, Kissinger made a fundamental distinction between legitimate and non-legitimate international orders, depending on the existence of a common code of conduct among nations. Kissinger added that while international politics is often described as a system determined by the physical and material elements of power, the role played by intangibles such as the sense of common purpose is absolutely relevant. In particular, Kissinger stated that the order of the concert of Europe relied not only on the material balance of power, but primarily on a sense of shared values among the European states. When that common code of conduct faded away, the Congress system absolutely stopped working. Indeed, the history of the concert of Europe, as Kissinger told us, was a story of success, but also a story of failure. The Congress system was not able, it could not restrain the political force that the concert itself was designed to contain. That political force was nationalism, a force that was going to change the political map of Europe in the 19th century and the political map of the world in the 20th century. In this total new world, the dynastic principle was replaced by the idea of the national state, which gradually began to dominate European politics. In the years following the Congress of Vienna, European great powers seemed to consolidate their empires and influence, but in reality, a new conflict began. Such a conflict was initially formed by many small wars around Europe that took place in different times, but which all contributed to the triumph of the nation, and then to the end of the old continental empires. Nationalism succeeded, for example, in transforming the Italian peninsula, in the famous words of Metternich, from a geographical expression into a state. In the following decades, the birth of other national states like Germany, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Albania, jeopardized the system created by the Congress of Vienna and ended up in the tragedy of the First World War. In so doing, the previous common code of conduct was definitively buried. Following Kissinger logic, one may suggest that even the present international disorder is the result of a lack of a common code of conduct. In the European theater of 200 years ago, one aspect of this common code of conduct was religion, embodied, linked to the Holy Alliance, an alliance between the throne and the altar that was considered a necessary instrument to restrain the revolutionary movement of Europe. Now, after the end of the Cold War, we don't need anymore an Holy Alliance, but we need rather a great alliance, capable to create new cooperative regimes and dialogue among the great powers, as it was tried in Vienna in a world dominated by Europe. If we want to update the word holy in the contemporary context, we have to remind that religions may have still a significant role in the world, but religions, the plural, and not only Christianity as it was for Europe 2 centuries ago. Even today, religions, in fact, can and must offer a great contribution to the future of mankind, but only if they refuse violence as a political instrument and create, as it was not the case in 1815, a just distance between the throne and the altar. If there is a common conduct today, this is the question. This is not an easy question, because examining the current world, we find ourselves in a very peculiar situation. While there is a global convergence in the economic area, indeed, market economy is prevailing everywhere, and there are also many common interests and examples of daily cooperation. Countries like China, Russia, and the United States don't share a common political culture. Difficulties in solving relative crises like Libya, Syria, and Ukraine may derive not only from opposing interests, but because the great powers diverge on basic questions like domestic political institutions, democracy, promotion abroad, human rights, and many other political values that are the foundation of our society. Although the absence of a common political culture, as Kissinger rightly argued, is certainly a problem for building a legitimate world order, it is not an insurmountable obstacle to its realization. There is still room for diplomacy. Let us take the example of the recent treaty on the Iranian nuclear program. No one is in the position to tell whether the agreement will contribute to stabilize the region. Nevertheless, the treaty marks a new beginning for American-Iranian relations in a very important area after more than 35 years of diplomatic closure. Thanks to a great diplomatic effort by both parts, the fears concerning the Iranian nuclear program have been channeled into a constructive way. Nobody knows whether the agreement will have a stable, happy end, but diplomacy was the key to prepare a solution of the tension between Iran and the international community. And I believe, more generally, that the possibility of constructing a new legitimate world order would be helped by the revival of diplomacy as an instrument of foreign policy. But a necessary condition to revive diplomacy is an attitude of compromise that helps to understand the point of view of other nations, especially of those countries that are considered as strategic rivals. In other words, the United States, and this is not easy, should recognize the values, the legitimate interest, the security concerns of China and Russia. And the other side, and this is not easy, Beijing and Moscow should recognize the legitimate interest of the United States and Europe and the importance of the liberal values at the basis of our society. In this most recent book, World Order, Henry Kissinger identifies as one of the major shortcomings of the present international order the absence of an effective mechanism for the major power to consult and possibly to cooperate on the most consequential issues. Doubtless, the result of many multilateral institutions like the G8 and even the G20 are really disappointing and often amount to a mere declaration of intent with few real practical consequences. And this is the reason why I do believe that a potential method of global governance could be now by necessity a quadrangle relationship among China, the European Union, Russia, and the United States. Although we should not forget the very important role played by the so-called BRICS country, I think that a cooperative regime based on a sort of quadrangle government is a viable, even if temporary, instrument to pull the values-related question together under one single political umbrella. In other words, we need a great concert among the main world players in facing today's challenge in Central Europe, especially Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in Asia, and this list is certainly not exhaustive. That has been done in 1748 with the Peace of Westphalia, in 1815 in Vienna, and in some extent in 1945 in San Francisco, as Kissinger remarks in the World Order. However, we seem to move in a different direction toward a new confrontation which are likely to deepen the existing crisis. Different goals and different strategies prevail. Goals and strategies that don't take into account the changing political and economic weight of emerging powers. China is betting on its economic growth and on the possibility to achieve in the coming years the technologically and military levels of the United States. As a consequence, today China is not eager to modify the existing rules of the game. Beijing thinks that time is on her side because Chinese leaders know that they will be more able to influence the international agenda in the future when China will be stronger. Not coincidentally, China is creating its own institutions, such as the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and is massively investing in the new logistical routes like the new Silk Road. Understandably, the United States still considers itself as a dominant power in many fields. Despite a relative loss of economic weight and influence, The United States is still well placed in the world and does not want to change the balance inside the international institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Russia is instead relying both on the personal ability of President Putin and on the well-known Russian tradition to resist any foreign challenge. Europe is too fragmented and divided to be considered one of the four pillars in the international system. Europe is a strange combination of strength and weakness. It is one of the biggest economic players in the world, but it still remains a political dwarf. Or to use a different metaphor, Europe is a giant with a feet of clay that does not move because it's too afraid to collapse. Europe has decided to refuse to politically exist in the world, or even worse, it seems not to find a reason to exist. The present state of the Union is particularly disappointing because until now, a few years ago, the European Union was not only an institution, but an ideal of democracy and solidarity. And celebrating the anniversary of the Congress of Vienna, we have to recognize and underline the European contradiction, that the European Union, born in order to overcome the tragic consequence of an exasperated nationalism, is now becoming more and more under the dominance of the member states. The European Union was born to create a closer and closer cooperation among different countries, based not on strength of individual states, but on the principle of equal cooperation. For almost 2 generations, this effort was broadly successful, in spite of ups and downs, which are always inevitable aspects of the historical process. Integration among European countries has materialized not only in the gradual construction of a common market, but also in the free circulation of goods and people until the creation of a common currency. And it's here, in this occasion, it seems useful to remind that the two main pillars of the modern statehood are the army and the currency. A common army, potentially the symbol of the new Europe, was vetoed by the French Assembly in 1954. But almost after half a century, the creation of a common currency gave the message that the transformation of the modern nation-state was taking place in spite of all the difficulties. This new and brave project was paralleled by another historical achievement, the enlargement of a union not only to the country previously belonging to the Western Europe, but also to the former members of the Warsaw Pact. For many reasons, has been a great success, is the only case in history of a massive exporting of democracy abroad through real democratic instruments. None like the citizens of Vienna can testify the meaning and the importance of the enlargement of the European Union. This process of democratic growth was generated and accompanied by the progressive growth of the two main European supranational bodies, the European Commission and the European Parliament. However, in the recent year, especially after the beginning of the economic crisis, an opposite direction has been taken with the return of the nation states, with the consequent shift of power from the Commission to the Member States, and with the construction of a pyramidal structure among the European nations. The European Central Bank has now become the most important supranational body of the Union. Actually, we have to be truly grateful to the European Central Bank for having preserved in its monetary policy a European perspective. Nevertheless, it is clear that this action cannot replace the role of the democratic bodies which were supposed to build and run the Union. Sorry, I apologize myself if I have dedicated too much attention to the European experiment, but my considerations are meant to emphasize that without a renewed unity, the European state will not play any significant roles in world politics, while 2 centuries ago, here in Vienna, they were the only players. Leaving now aside Europe, we have to conclude that even the other 3 great powers, China, Russia, and United States, are very far from having built what Kissinger defined an effective mechanism to consult and possibly to cooperate on the most consequential issues. At the moment, such a mechanism does not exist, even in that area in which all great powers have a common, shared, clear interest, like the fight against international terrorism. Not only terrorism is a threat for all major powers, but it is clear that only through global action can defeat the global peril posed by terrorist organizations. Nevertheless, at present it does not seem possible to build a common code of conduct necessary to put in action a common response. If it is difficult to find a common policy for a problem where the common interest is so clear, because it's the same problem for China, Russia, Europe, and the United States, it will be even more difficult to tackle with a common action the other great challenges that we are now facing, such as the never-ending problem of migrations, poverty alleviation in underdeveloped countries, and the increasing disparities within almost all the countries of the world. In fact, we are not facing only a global political disorder, but also a series of social and economic disorders. That should be, at this point, another chapter to open, a chapter that marks a difference from Kissinger's book about Vienna and today's problems. The sovereignty is not any more limited by geographical borders of the nation. Sovereignty today is more diffuse and even more is hidden. There are new players in the world ground, new technologies, new borderless financial realities, new global companies, new networks that fly uncontrolled over our planet. Now, new invisible networks shape the world in direction that no one by itself is able to control. Indeed, the United States, Russia, and China, and hopefully Europe, should invent and implement a new, renewed common code of conduct necessary to devise innovative solutions for these new great challenges that are in front of us. From this viewpoint, great powers have a number of demanding tasks to accomplish. First task, increasing concrete step, increasing the cooperation in specific areas like Ukraine, the fight against ISIS, the Syrian case, in order to avoid that this conflict become too deeply rooted like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Second task, devising mechanism of permanent cooperation and exchange of information regarding the great challenge facing mankind like environment, degradation, migration, growing inequality, and the new financial and technological networks. Not coincidentally, Chinese President Xi and President Obama had a long meeting concerning not the past project, but cyber warfare. This is certainly a positive step in the direction of global cooperation, but it's a signal of the new problems. Third and final task to accomplish is reshaping and refund the UN system, since we live in a world significantly different from 1945. Our problems are more and more global, and you like or not, the United Nations is the only international institution with a real global dimension. And therefore, we need a strong reform of the United Nations system. Here, I am not referring to cosmetic change that we had in the past, but rather to real reforms, giving the UN the appropriate instruments for implementing the decisions adopted. The creation of a military permanent force, as it was proposed in 1945, is not an easy project to develop, but, I repeat, we need appropriate instrument to implement UN decision. I understand that there is a high level of utopia in these proposals. An even higher level of utopia because today we are celebrating the Congress of Vienna, the paramount expression of realpolitik. And an additional utopia after having discussed how difficult it is to overcome the national interest even when a state is a member of a shared pact, as it's the case of the European Union. Nevertheless, it's time to think to some bold action in order to save the future of our beloved mankind. I have spoken too much. I hope you excuse me. But before leaving the floor, let me thank our host for the kind invitation and for the organization of this impressive conference. I wish you a great Congress of Vienna. Thank you.